America's K-shaped economy is here to stay. If you haven't heard that term yet, well, it's a fancy way of saying the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It pretty much describes the country's worsening inequality.
In November of the year 2025, the United States recorded a trade deficit increase of 94.6% in a single month, jumping from roughly 29.2 billion United States dollars to nearly 56.8 billion United States dollars, the fastest monthly deterioration in the modern history of American trade accounting, and a result so severe that it immediately exposed the trade war as a systemic failure rather than a negotiating tactic. Instead, the data revealed something far more alarming. Imports surged. Exports collapsed. Production costs inside the United States accelerated sharply. Capital began to reposition. Allies quietly rewrote trade priorities. And Canada, long viewed as a secondary economic partner, emerged as a primary beneficiary of America's instability. What appeared, on the surface, to be a dispute over tariffs quickly transformed into a much deeper crisis involving trade credibility, legal authority, and global trust in the United States as an economic anchor. And what comes next is far more disturbing, because buried inside this trade deficit shock is a structural failure so severe that it has never been openly acknowledged, a hidden economic wound already inflicting damage measured in the hundreds of billions of United States dollars. And today I will reveal why this undisclosed weakness may cost the United States far more than any tariff ever collected. The 94.6% surge in the United States trade deficit in November of the year 2025 was not the result of a single failure, but the convergence of multiple breakdowns occurring simultaneously across imports, exports, and domestic production capacity. According to publicly available trade data, total United States imports rose by approximately 5% in a single month, translating into an increase of more than 17 billion United States dollars worth of foreign goods entering the American economy in just 30 days. At the same time, exports moved sharply in the opposite direction. United States exports fell by roughly 3.6% month over month, wiping out an estimated 12 billion United States dollars in outbound trade value almost overnight. This divergence alone would have been alarming. Together, it created one of the fastest trade imbalance accelerations ever recorded outside of a formal recession. The most severe damage came from capital goods and industrial inputs. Imports of machinery, advanced electronics, and data infrastructure equipment climbed by more than 7 billion United States dollars in November alone. Driven largely by artificial intelligence expansion and energy transition projects that could not be delayed despite tariff pressure, the United States did not suddenly become more import dependent by choice. It became import dependent because domestic alternatives did not exist at scale. At the same time, the trade war inflicted a crushing blow on export competitiveness. Tariffs raised the cost of foundational inputs inside the United States at historic speed. By late 2025, domestic aluminum prices were more than 40% higher than pre-tariff levels. Steel costs followed a similar trajectory. These materials are embedded in automobiles, construction equipment, aircraft components, appliances, and industrial machinery. When input costs rise at this magnitude, export margins collapse automatically. The data shows this clearly. United States automotive exports declined by an estimated 9.8 billion United States dollars year over year. Heavy machinery shipments to Europe fell by more than 20%. Agricultural exports to Asia dropped by approximately 18 billion United States dollars as buyers rerouted long-term contracts away from American suppliers to avoid tariff volatility. Even regions historically aligned with Washington adjusted rapidly. The United States trade deficit with the European Union more than doubled in a single reporting period, expanding from roughly 6.3 billion United States dollars to over 14 billion United States dollars. This shift coincided with European trade agreements finalized with India and Southeast Asia, signaling a deliberate reduction in exposure to United States policy risk. What makes these numbers especially dangerous is their timing. Only 1 month earlier, In October of the year 2025, the trade deficit appeared to fall to its lowest level since the year 2009. That apparent improvement was widely cited as proof that tariffs were working. In reality, it was a statistical illusion. Corporations delayed shipments, accelerated others, and rerouted logistics to exploit tariff windows. Pharmaceutical imports collapsed one month, then surged the next by more than $6 billion United States dollars, not because demand changed, but because confidence vanished. Capital goods orders froze temporarily as firms waited for clarity that never arrived. October was not a recovery. It was the pause before impact. By November, the illusion shattered. The trade war did not suppress imports. It did not revive exports. It did not rebalance trade. It amplified every structural weakness inside the United States economy at once. And this is where the story turns far darker, because these trade numbers are only the surface damage. Hidden beneath them is a capital shift already underway, a silent movement of money, investment, and trust that threatens to inflict losses far greater than the trade deficit itself. And once you see that pattern, it becomes clear why what happens next may be impossible to reverse. What followed the November trade deficit shock was not loud, and it was not immediate, but it was far more dangerous. Capital began to move. While trade statistics capture the flow of goods, they lag behind the movement that truly determines economic power, the movement of money, confidence, and long-term investment. By late 2025, the trade war had crossed that threshold. Investors were no longer reacting to tariffs. They were reacting to the realization that policy inside the United States had become unpredictable, legally fragile, and strategically reversible. Open market data shows that foreign holders of United States government debt began reducing exposure at a steady and accelerating pace. Over the final quarter of the year 2025, overseas institutions trimmed an estimated $620 billion United States dollars from United States Treasury holdings. This was not a panic sale. It was methodical, disciplined, and deeply unsettling. Japanese financial institutions alone reduced their treasury exposure by approximately 190 billion United States dollars, while major European pension and sovereign funds followed with reallocations into euro-denominated infrastructure bonds and Asian development instruments. These entities are among the most conservative investors on the planet. When they reposition, it signals not fear, but loss of trust. Bond markets responded with brutal clarity. Despite intervention from the Federal Reserve, yields on long-dated United States debt rose sharply, forcing the Treasury to issue short-term debt at increasingly punitive rates. By the end of the year 2025, annual federal interest expenses surpassed $1.3 trillion United States dollars, quietly overtaking national defense spending. This is a fiscal threshold historically associated with systemic stress, not with economic leadership. At the same time, the legal foundation of the trade war began to fracture. Federal courts ruled that declaring trade deficits a national emergency under emergency economic powers lacked legal precedent. When the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in November of the year 2025, global markets understood the implication immediately. If tariffs could be invalidated after collection, then every contract priced around them was suddenly exposed to retroactive risk. Internal estimates circulating among financial institutions suggested that tariff refunds could reach between $65 billion and $120 billion United States dollars, creating an unplanned fiscal hole in an already strained federal budget. For investors, this was not about refunds. It was about governance failure. Policy that can vanish under judicial review is not policy. It is volatility disguised as authority. Currency markets absorbed the shock next. The United States dollar did not collapse. Something far more dangerous happened. It began to be quietly avoided. Trade settlement agreements expanded outside the dollar. Energy contracts experimented with alternative pricing frameworks. Regional trade blocs increased local currency usage, not as protest, but as insurance. This is how reserve currencies weaken, not through headlines, but through incremental exclusion. As capital slowed, credit tightened, As credit tightened, consumer prices rose further under tariff pressure. Household appliances climbed sharply in price. Vehicle costs increased by thousands of dollars per unit. Pharmaceutical pricing became erratic, producing localized shortages followed by emergency imports at premium rates. Real wages stagnated while costs accelerated, hollowing out purchasing power across the American middle class. While the United States absorbed this financial shock, Canada moved in the opposite direction. Capital flowed north. Foreign direct investment into Canadian manufacturing and logistics surged by more than 27% year over year, according to cross-border investment tracking. Canadian ports expanded capacity. Rail corridors modernized. Long-term procurement contracts were rewritten to anchor production outside United States tariff risk. This was not retaliation. It was reallocation. And here lies the most unsettling truth of all. Once capital adjusts, it does not wait for elections, court rulings, or policy reversals. It builds new centers of gravity. The money that left did not pause. It found a new home. And in the next part, we will expose how this capital shift detonated the industrial core of the United States itself, collapsing manufacturing ecosystems that may never return, and transferring the future of auto and electric vehicle production to Canada in a way that has not yet been fully disclosed to the public. The damage inflicted by the trade war did not remain confined to balance sheets or capital flows. By early 2026, it reached the physical economy, where consequences are irreversible. Factories slowed. Assembly lines went dark. Supplier networks collapsed. And the industrial base of the United States entered its most severe contraction outside a declared recession in more than half a century. Manufacturing output data shows that industrial utilization inside the United States fell below 71%, a level historically associated with mass layoffs rather than temporary adjustment. Within 6 months, manufacturers across automotive, machinery, aerospace, and advanced equipment sectors eliminated an estimated 400,000 jobs, including direct plant workers, parts suppliers, logistics contractors, and tooling specialists. These losses were not evenly distributed. They concentrated in the very regions tariffs were supposed to protect. The automotive sector absorbed the heaviest blow. Tariffs raised the cost of aluminum, steel, and electronic components at a speed no automaker could absorb. By late 2025, average production costs for vehicles assembled in the United States had risen between 28% and 41%, depending on drivetrain and materials intensity. These increases were not offset by pricing power. Global buyers simply turned elsewhere. Vehicle exports from the United States collapsed. Orders were delayed. Contracts were rewritten. Entire production runs were canceled. Within a single year, American automotive exports fell by more than 50 billion United States dollars, erasing nearly a decade of incremental gains. Supplier firms operating on thin margins failed in rapid succession. Once a Tier 2 or Tier 3 supplier disappears, the ecosystem does not regenerate, tooling is scrapped, skilled labor disperses, institutional knowledge vanishes. The electric vehicle transition turned this collapse into a strategic catastrophe. Electric vehicles are not simply cars. They are rolling supply chains. Batteries require lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and advanced chemical processing. Power electronics require semiconductors the United States does not produce at scale. Tariffs inflated input costs while offering no credible domestic substitute. As a result, electric vehicles produced inside the United States became among the most expensive in the world to manufacture. Multinational automakers responded without ceremony. Investment plans were revised quietly but decisively. New battery plants, assembly lines, and supplier hubs were redirected away from the United States. Forecasts that once placed the majority of North American electric vehicle capacity south of the border were rewritten entirely. Internal planning models circulating among suppliers projected that nearly 40% of all future electric vehicle capacity growth in North America would now occur outside the United States. Canada captured that shift with surgical precision. Rather than attempting to replicate every upstream input domestically, Canada positioned itself as the stable integration hub within a diversified global network. Policy continuity replaced improvisation. Legal clarity replaced emergency decrees. By prioritizing auto and electric vehicle manufacturing labeled Made in Canada, Ottawa reduced exposure to United States tariff volatility while preserving access to European and Asian components through negotiated frameworks. The results were immediate and dramatic. By the end of the year 2025, announced investments into Canadian electric vehicle and battery manufacturing exceeded 120 billion United States dollars, surpassing total comparable investment flowing into the United States over the same period. Battery plants, assembly facilities, and advanced materials processing hubs clustered in Ontario and Quebec, supported by logistics corridors that bypassed United States tariff risk entirely. This realignment triggered a second-order shock. Long-term procurement contracts for aluminum, cathode materials, power electronics, and advanced components were rewritten to exclude United States suppliers altogether. Analysts estimated that more than 180 billion United States dollars in automotive and electric vehicle supply chain value effectively evaporated from the American economy, redistributed across Canada, Europe, and East Asia. What makes this collapse uniquely devastating is its permanence. Manufacturing ecosystems do not return simply because policy changes. Capital has already moved. Workers have already relocated. Suppliers have already restructured. Even a complete reversal of tariffs would not restore the lost network. The industrial core that once anchored the United States to global manufacturing leadership has been fractured beyond quick repair. Meanwhile, Canadian manufacturing gained scale, efficiency, and credibility. Unit costs fell as output rose. Exports expanded steadily rather than erratically. International buyers adjusted procurement strategies around Canadian reliability, not American volatility. The contrast became unavoidable. And yet, even this industrial collapse is not the most dangerous consequence of the trade war. Because what ultimately sealed the fate of the United States was not lost factories or lost jobs, but the moment global markets concluded that American economic policy itself could not be trusted to survive its own legal system. By the end of the year 2025, the trade war had crossed a final and far more dangerous line. It was no longer merely an economic strategy that failed. It had become a legal and fiscal crisis that directly undermined the credibility of the United States as a governing system. The foundation of the tariff regime rested on the claim that trade deficits constituted a national emergency. That claim was unprecedented. Federal courts moved quickly. Judges ruled that using emergency economic powers to justify broad trade restrictions exceeded statutory authority. For markets, this was not a technical dispute. It was a signal that the core policy driving the trade war might not survive judicial review. When the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in November of the year 2025, the implications were immediate and severe. Investors understood that tariffs already collected could be ruled unlawful after the fact. That realization detonated a risk scenario few policymakers had prepared for. By conservative estimates based on publicly available customs revenue data, the United States Treasury had collected approximately 180 billion United States dollars in tariff revenue under the challenged framework. Legal analysts warned that potential refund liabilities could range from 65 billion to more than 120 billion United States dollars, depending on how broadly the courts invalidated the policy. This was not a hypothetical accounting adjustment. It was a potential fiscal shock large enough to destabilize budget projections mid-cycle. Bond markets reacted with surgical precision. Yields rose not because investors feared insolvency, but because they feared institutional dysfunction. A government that collects revenue under legal uncertainty and risks being forced to refund it retroactively introduces a level of unpredictability incompatible with long-term capital planning. Borrowing costs climbed across the yield curve. Short-term issuance expanded at punitive rates. Debt servicing obligations accelerated beyond sustainable projections. By early 2026, Annual federal interest expenses exceeded $1.3 trillion United States dollars, consuming a larger share of revenue than national defense spending. Historically, this threshold has been associated with emerging market stress, not with the world's largest economy. The trade war, sold as a revenue-generating tool, had quietly become a multiplier of fiscal fragility. The political response compounded the damage. Rather than restoring confidence, the administration escalated rhetoric. Judges were attacked, alternative tariff authorities were floated, new threats were issued without legislative backing. From a market perspective, this confirmed the worst possible outcome: policy volatility without institutional restraint. America's trading partners adjusted accordingly. Long-term negotiations were frozen. Procurement contracts were rewritten with explicit clauses tied to United States tariff risk. Arbitration venues shifted away from American jurisdictions. The legal system that once anchored global commerce became, paradoxically, a source of uncertainty. In stark contrast, Canada benefited from doing nothing extraordinary. It did not invoke emergency powers. It did not threaten retroactive penalties. It emphasized parliamentary authority, legal continuity, and predictable trade governance. For multinational firms weighing long-term commitments, this distinction outweighed subsidies, tax incentives, or rhetoric. Capital does not chase promises, it chases enforceability. As a result, investment that once defaulted to the United States flowed toward Canada with increasing confidence. Credit risk premiums tightened north of the border even as they widened in the United States. The trade war did not merely weaken American leverage, it transferred institutional trust to its closest ally. What made this moment catastrophic was permanence. Legal credibility, once damaged, cannot be restored through elections or speeches alone. Markets remember. Contracts remember. Capital allocation models remember. The United States did not just lose a trade dispute. It exposed a vulnerability in its governance that the global system immediately priced in. And yet, even this legal and fiscal collapse does not represent the final consequence of the trade war, because the most profound shift is still unfolding quietly beyond courts and budgets in the architecture of global power itself. By the first quarter of the year 2026, the consequences of the trade war had moved beyond economics, beyond law, and beyond politics. What emerged instead was a structural reordering of global power, one that no single election, court ruling, or policy reversal could easily undo. The numbers alone told a devastating story. On an annualized basis, the United States trade deficit surged past $820 billion United States dollars, the largest nominal deficit ever recorded, despite the highest effective tariff levels since the Smoot-Hawley era. Imports remained essential. Exports remained structurally uncompetitive. Tariffs had not corrected the imbalance. They had locked it in. Foreign direct investment into the United States collapsed by an estimated 38% year over year, with greenfield manufacturing projects absorbing the heaviest losses. Entire sectors were quietly written off by global planners. Automotive manufacturing, advanced electronics, clean energy equipment, pharmaceutical production. Executives cited the same four reasons repeatedly: policy volatility, legal uncertainty, retaliatory exposure, and declining domestic demand. The United States was no longer viewed as the default destination for long-term capital. At the same time, Canada absorbed a disproportionate share of this reallocation. Investment flows north accelerated, manufacturing capacity expanded, logistics corridors modernized. Canadian exports reached record levels not through distortion, but through diversification. Canada did not replace the United States as a single dominant power. It became something more dangerous to lose: a trusted platform. The psychological break was as damaging as the financial one. For decades, the global system operated under an implicit assumption that when uncertainty rises, the United States stabilizes the system. During the trade war, the opposite occurred. The United States became the primary source of uncertainty. Emergency powers replaced negotiation. Litigation replaced diplomacy. Threats replaced predictability. Once this perception hardened, it could not be reversed by rhetoric. The dollar remained powerful, but its dominance was no longer unquestioned. Not because another currency defeated it, but because global actors learned how to reduce dependence on it. Trade settlement diversified. Energy contracts experimented with alternatives. Regional systems expanded quietly. This was not collapse. It was suffocation by design. What made this reordering irreversible was timing. While Washington argued internally, the rest of the world adapted externally. Supply chains were rebuilt. Contracts were rewritten. New trade corridors formed. Capital allocation models adjusted. Even if every tariff were eliminated tomorrow, the world would not simply return. The incentives have changed. The routes have changed. The trust has moved. At the center of this transformation stands the trade war itself. It was not merely a policy error. It was a strategic miscalculation that taught allies and competitors the same lesson at the same time. The United States could no longer be relied upon as a stable economic anchor. Canada's rise did not come from confrontation. It came from competence. It did not threaten. It did not improvise. It did not gamble with emergency powers. It honored contracts. It preserved legal clarity. In a fragmented global economy, that combination proved more valuable than dominance. History will not remember the trade war as an effort to protect American workers. It will remember it as the moment the global system discovered it could function without the United States at the center. And the most uncomfortable question, now facing policymakers, investors, and citizens alike, is not whether the trade war failed. It is whether the United States can ever fully regain the trust it so publicly surrendered. Is this a bold strategy? Or was it a catastrophic mistake for the United States in an era where stability has become the most valuable currency of all? Thanks for watching.